In this video, we will understand the concept of class and object in Java. So what is a class? A class is a named entity, a name or a tag that we give to an entity or to a type. What exactly does it mean? I will explain it in some time, but for now, understand that it's basically a name. Second thing is it's a template or a blueprint. But blueprint of what? It's a blueprint, it's a template of how an object would actually look like. So this is a template or a blueprint. A class has some attributes and behavior. So a class would have some properties, and the behavior, that means the methods that it would support. What will a class do? So that's about attributes and behavior. Now coming to the object, what exactly is the object? So object is the runtime representation of a class. It is created from a class. That's why we said that the class is a template, because if we don't have a template, if we don't have a model, JVM or the virtual machine has no idea how to create an object. So in order to have an object, we must declare a class. So it is created from a class. An object has some states, so whatever variables or the attributes that we define in the class, we have to initialize them with some given values, and those values, you can say, it is called the state of that object. We will understand this point in a bit more detail. The third step is, or the third point is, each object is unique. So it's not necessary to have a single object only. We can create n number of objects from a class. So let's say we have a, okay, so let's move on to the maybe a little workshop, a small workshop, where we can understand the concept of class and object in a bit more detail. So I hope you understand the theory part of it, basically the points that I just explained. Now let's move on. Let's say we have to create a class, and we have to create it for a student. So if we talk about the student, a student in itself doesn't represent anything. It's not a concrete entity. So if I say this is a student, you will ask, what about it? What is the name of this student? Who is it? What is the gender of that student? So that's how we define an entity. So a student is basically an entity, and we know that. So for example, student, let's write it down. Student is basically an entity, and from the analysis, from the brainstorming, we know that a student has certain properties. A student would have a name, for example. A student would also have a roll number, and a student will have a gender. Now coming to the behavior, what would a student do? What are the behaviors supported by a student? So the most common behavior of a student will be that a student will study, right? So let's focus on a single attribute or maybe behavior, that a student would study. Now let's map this to our definitions of class and object. So in this case, we can say that the student is basically a class. The name, roll number and gender are the attributes or the properties supported by the student. We don't know the values yet, but we are defining a template, a blueprint. So these properties will basically, these are variables when we declare the class student. And study is the behavior supported by student that will be converted into a method when we will write the class student. Now let's define this class. Let's write a class student. Okay, for now let's not focus on the Java syntax, but let's say it has three properties: name, roll number and gender, and it has a method study, and let's say it does something. Now we have a class, but this class is basically a definition. It's not doing anything. How do we create an object of this class? So what we do, When we have a class, we often compile it first. We compile all the Java code and we get the .class file, which is basically an intermediate code that will be executed by JVM. So when we have a class and when we feed it to JVM, JVM will create an object of that class. So let's take the example of student. Student is basically a class, a template. We defined it that it would have these three properties and this behavior a single method. Now when we say that Andy is a student, when we say that Andy is a student, then we are actually creating an object of that class. It is a runtime representation. It has some values. Why? Because in this case the name variable would be Andy. Let's say the roll number is 123 and the gender is male, and study, let's say, do some default task. And let's define another student, let's say Jessica. In this case the name is Jessica, roll number is, let's say, 101, and the gender is female, and again the default implementation of the method study. So when we actually define, or when we actually create two persons, two concrete students out of that student class, then we say that these are the objects of that class. And here we can see we can create n number of objects. We need to define the class once, but there could be n number of objects. There could be hundreds of students with their own details, with their own variables. That's why we say that an object is the runtime representation of a class, and it has its state. So in this case this object has its state in the form of ND 123 and male, and similarly this particular object has its own state, Jessica 101 and female, and these two objects are unique. They have their own identity. So just to summarize, a class is basically a definition, a template, how a type would look like, and the object is the runtime representation of that class. Hope it's clear. In the next video we will run a simple program. We will create a couple of objects and we will see how to use them in a program. That's it. Thank you.